Hi everyone, it's Elise from Kit and Clouder, and in this video tutorial today we're going to be going through light source techniques. Now light source is often regarded as one of the most tricky topics for those that are learning how to colour, but it's also one of the most important topics. It's actually what takes your colouring from being flat and one-dimensional and helps to create more depth and realism. Basically what light source is, it's showing where the light comes down and hits part of the object, and then that side is going to be illuminated and a lot brighter. And this in turn helps to create shadows on the object. And the shadows are the darker areas, and they're what shows distance and shows depth, shows that our object is actually rounded. So you can see that this is very important in creating some realism, just like real life when we've got light and shadows happening. Now in all of our classes, we go through light source in extensive detail. So you'll be learning how to apply this to particular elements. For example, if we do the skin and hair class, we break down how the light affects different hairstyles and how different shadows are and how we would section off the hair to start to create detail. In our nature class, we would go through how the light affects petals in a flower and how we get areas that look like they're sitting up closer to the eye and areas that are further behind. So using light source to create distance. In this very simple exercise today, we're going to be going through how to shade up some geometric shapes just so you can get a bit more of an understanding of how light source works just on a really nice simple level and how it can start to transform your colouring. You can see here I've got my exercise sheet in front of us, and already I've got just the printout here on the left. Already you can see how these ones here look really nice and three-dimensional, just as opposed to just the flat images on the other side. Now you should have your image all printed out, ready to go. And in this tutorial, I'm just going to be using a mid-grey marker. Now I'm using a Copic marker W3, but you can use any color or any marker you like from your stash. Just make sure it's toward the lighter end. So you might choose to use something ending between, say, 2 to 4. If you're using Spectrum Noir's Promarkers or another brand, it's the same thing. We're looking toward that lower end. And it can be any color, it doesn't have to be grey as well. I'm also going to be using what's called the Colorless Blender here. And it's got a clear cap on the end. And that's just going to help us blend out those shadows on the edges. So grabbing these two markers here today, and let's get started. Okay, now you'll notice in our video tutorial that our image is slightly on a funny perspective. It's sort of warped a little bit. Now the reason for that is when we colour, we show our tutorials in very close detail so you can actually see what's happening with the nib of the marker. And for us to be able to do that without obscuring the nib, we do need to move it on a little bit of an angle. So that's why your image is not going to look straight today. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to be using just the one coloured marker today, which is my W3, and I'm also going to be using my Colorless Blender. I just wanted to use one marker for this step because we haven't yet gone over blending and how to make colours and all of that theory. So I wanted to just leave it as the one, make it nice and simple, and show you how we can layer up this marker to create more depth. Now, just to explain light source again, just nice and easy. We talked before about how we've got the sun in the sky. So it might not necessarily be the sun. We might be looking at lights in a ceiling, all different light sources that you can have. In this instance, I'm just pretending that there's a sun up here on the left. And I've drawn that in with my little yellow sun that's already on your exercise sheets. When you're colouring an image up, it's handy to do this little drawing of the sun somewhere above your image. Typically when we colour an image, the most attractive light source that we will get will be a top left or top right light source. And typically it's placed toward the way the image is facing, unless we're wanting to tell a more complex story. In this case, I'm going to start here with my light source at the top left. So this is the sun, and as you can imagine, the sun has rays of light that come down toward the earth and hit the image. You can imagine the sun is a lot bigger than this though, so that's really, really big right up in the sky, and the light rays come down the whole way in reality. So you can see there are lots of arrows showing how that sun would come down and hit this left side. So we know that wherever these light rays are hitting first, that's going to be the lightest part of the object. So all around these edges here, and especially this top panel, because that's where the sun is at that top, that's going to be the lightest part. So then we know that opposite that is going to be our darkest. So this side over here, where the light is not really hitting, those light rays are kind of missing that edge. You can imagine these would come down here, miss that edge. That's going to be quite dark. It's not getting hit by that light. So what we're going to do using our W3, I'm just going to pop in and add color to that side. That's going to be our dark shadow there. Now, we know that the light is hitting on this side as well, but this side over here is going to be hitting last. So we're going to get less light on this side. So what I'm going to do, just using the same marker, I'm just going to add a little bit of color to that right-hand side. And you can see I'm just lifting the marker here, getting a nice soft finish on my stroke. At this point we haven't gone over blending, so don't worry too much if it just ends in a hard line. What I'm going to do next is grab my Colorless Blender, and I'm just going to color over where the W3 has ended, and that's just going to soften out the line so we get that fade from the color down to the white. And you can see there already we've achieved that. So we've got the shadow here fading all the way to the light where we get lighter. So you can see there what I've got is the lightest part. And this is sort of a middle, this is in between because we've got some shadow and it does come to the light, and we've got the darkest area. Now if I was to describe this in technical terms, what we have is, I'm going to write a H here on this top, and that's my highlight. This one here, I'm going to write an M, that's my midtone. So midtone is between the lightest and the darkest areas. And then on this side will be an S, and that's my shadow. So we've got highlight for the lightest, midtone for in between, and shadow in the darkest areas. And they're the components that make up the light on the object. One more thing before we move on, there's a very important aspect of Lightsource that we need to cover, and that's what's called a cast shadow. Now I'm going to show you this really quickly by using my pen, and I do this in all of our classes. Okay, I've got my hand here and I'm going to put my pen on top. Now do you see that shadow on my hand? That's a cast shadow. A cast shadow is a shadow that's cast from an object in front or above onto an object behind. So the object that's behind is always in shadow. And the reason for this is it actually shows distance between the objects. You can see the closer my objects are, the darker the shadow. The further away, the lighter the shadow. So this is very, very important. Now cast shadows are what actually create that 3D depth. And you can imagine if I put my pen on the page here, I've actually got my pen sitting above the page and there's a shadow around the pen. That's the cast shadow there. It's showing that the pen is in front of the paper behind. So when I'm colouring up this cube over here, we've got the same thing. We've got an object which would be sitting in front of a ground, and I'm just going to draw the line of where my ground is extending there at the moment. So that's just the ground, no shadows. So my cube is in front of the ground, so we need to add that cast shadow. Sun coming from the top left, so you know the darkest side is going to be down here on the right. So all I'm going to do is just start at that edge and add some shading next to the object. Now I am going to pull a little bit from the midtone, only a tiny bit, because the object isn't flat, we need to show that it's three-dimensional coming around from that side. You can also grab your Colorless Blender again and just come back and soften that edge. And we've got that blend from the dark fading out to get lighter as we get further from the object. So again, that is a cast shadow, and it's showing that one object, our cube, is sitting in front of another object, which is the ground. Now let's move on. I'm going to actually move this over and do the right light source next. The middle one's always a little bit harder, so let's do the right one. It's literally just opposite of what we've just done. So our light rays would come down, hit the object there along the right. So we know that all of these areas are going to be lightest, with the top being the lightest as it's closer to that top light source. So we know the darkest here is going to be this face because it's hitting last. So I'm just going to pop in with my marker, shade along this back face here. We know that the side is going to be that mid-tone because we've got the light hitting along the right, but the left will be hit last. So I'm just applying a small amount of shading from the left, and then you can grab your Colorless Blender and soften out that edge so we get that nice transition from dark to light. And the top there is going to be our lightest. So remembering what we went through before, the lightest becomes the highlight. This side here where we've got light and shade between equal parts between highlight and shadow, it's going to be mid-tone. And this one here being quite dark is our shadow. We need to show our cast shadow as well, so you can draw in the ground if you like, you don't have to. It just always helps to give a bit more depth. And we're going to draw our shadow coming in from the back here. You can see the shadow always sort of positions itself further away from the light in the same direction. So we've got the light rays sort of coming down on this angle here, and the shadow is going through on that same angle. Soften the edge with that cast shadow. The further away we get from the object, the lighter the shadow becomes until it fades out to the general color of the ground. Now I'm going to work on the one in the middle. Now this has a light source coming from directly overhead. So this is a little bit different. When our light comes down like this, it's hitting that top face first. So that's still going to be the lightest. But all of these sides now are going to be quite dark because they're getting hit last. Now the darkest part is actually going to be the very top. That's where the object curves away from the light, so that's where the darkest amount of color will go. So I'm laying down this color first. You can do a few layers of it here. But as we get further down the object, it sort of disperses and becomes a little softer. So now I'm going to come back over all of it and bring the color down to the bottom. And what we've done is actually just layered up this color now, but it's just that tiny bit darker at the top where we added that shading at the start. And that shows that where that object's curving away from the light, it's just got that tiny bit more of a darker finish there, showing that depth. Our shadow now, we're just going to come underneath just a very tiny amount. Just along the sides. Oops, I didn't draw in my ground there if you want to draw that in. So just added a small amount here just to show that there is some shadow. Colorless Blender to soften. The shadow is not as long as the other two, And that's because when my light source is directly overhead, it doesn't make a big shadow, it just makes a very small one. We still need to have that depth of the cast shadow being underneath the object, but it's only a very small amount because it's going straight down, those light rays. And that's our 3 cubes, they're done. And you can see how different each one looks depending on where that light is situated. We've told a different story in each one. We can go ahead now and do the next object. So I'm going to go ahead here and do the sphere. So I've just got a circle on the page right now at the moment. And I want to create some depth to make that look 3-dimensional, because at the moment it's just a 2D object. You can draw your ground in around the shape as well if you like, just to help you get a bit more of an idea. Notice the ground always starts back from the bottom of the object. An object will never sit right on top of the ground. It always, when you're looking at something, the ground extends further back, and that's also what gives you a little bit of depth perspective as well. Now looking at this one here, remember a light source coming from the top left, the light rays are going to come down here and they're going to hit this top left side first. That's going to be the lightest, it's going to be our highlight. The opposite to that is the bottom right corner. So I'm going to add in this color. Now again, the shading here doesn't need to be neat, we're just laying down the darkest color. I'm doing a few layers here, building up that depth. And then as I get a little bit further out, I'm just going to bring the color over the top and extend just a little bit more. But you'll notice it's lighter as I get to that middle point. I'm going to bring in my Colorless Blender and just shade over that middle there, and you can see what I've created now is, here is my shadow, so that's furthest from the light. The lightest is my highlight, and in the middle of the object I've sort of got that in-between color. It's lighter, but there's still color there. That's the midtone. So the midtone is sitting between the highlight and the shadow. Now we still need our cast shadow. The sphere is on top of the ground. So just going to pop underneath. You'll notice our shadow is kind of rounded as well. Your shadow should always mimic the shape of the object. Colorless Blender just to soften. And there you go, that is cast shadow there. Moving on, going to the top right light source. Light rays coming down, it's just the opposite of what we've just done. So this area here is going to be our lightest, so we know that's the highlight. Come down from the side, add your shading in from the bottom left. You can extend the color a little bit further up toward the top right where the light is. Bring your Colorless Blender over where that ends. So we've got highlight, shadow, and midtone right there. Draw your ground if you want, or if you don't like to draw the ground, you can simply just draw in your shadows. And soften that edge down. You can see how the shadow still gives it that presence on the page, so it's not just stuck right there or not floating in midair. Coming from above, now this is the same as the cube. Light rays come down from the top, so we know the top of the shape is going to be the lightest. That's the highlight through there. The opposite is the bottom, so I'm going to start at the bottom, extending strokes up overlapping it, making it darker in the shadow, and then you can extend softly toward the middle. And bring in that Colorless Blender just to soften down. So highlight, mid-tone in the middle, and shadow. Underneath, remembering before when the light's coming from the top, we only get a very small shadow underneath. So it's almost like an oval type shape here. Just doing that nice and small along the bottom. You can soften that out as well. You can see how different, again, each of those objects look. But now, rather than just being flat, we've got dimension. These just started off as circles before, and now they actually look like they're rounding. As our object curves away from the light in each of these three instances, it gets darker, showing that it is affected by that light and shade. Moving on to the cones. Now the cone is a little bit of a different shape here. And what happens is we've got the object and it curves away from the light on both sides here. Almost the same with how our sphere has done, but the whole thing is curved the whole way around. So we need to show that that's not just flat. We need to show a perspective that that is curving away from the light. So let's work first on this top left light source. So our light's going to come down. Notice how it's hitting that side first, but what happens with this is it would come all the whole way over here, extending my little light rays down, and it actually hit part of this right hand side as well, and that's what's going to show that the light is sort of illuminating around. So when I do my shadow, I'm just going to leave a little gap. And I've actually just left that very edge there as a white. Then I'm going to bring this color around. You can see I'm working with the shape of the object as well. So my strokes here are actually slightly curved rather than just flat toward that side. I'm going to use my Colorless Blender and just soften out the edge. And just to show that we've got that three-dimensional depth there, as the shape curves back away from the light on this side, I'm going to add a tiny amount of this darker color. And you can soften that with your Colorless Blender as well. I'm softening that right down so it's only very small. But notice how that extra piece of shading makes that look a lot more three-dimensional. It's showing that it's curving around and that the light's hitting different parts of the image. So this is when we start to get a little bit trickier, because it's not just a cube or a sphere. You're starting to create different kind of shapes and they need different shadows. So that's what we're creating at the moment. Our car shadow underneath, we're going to come from the very side here and extend away from the light the whole way around that base. Colorless Blender underneath, and you can see the shadow is just a bit longer on the side that's further from the light as well, just to show that depth around. Come in with the shape with the light source at the top right. Light rays come down. If you still need to draw these in, please feel free. You don't have to. We know that side's going to be illuminated, so the opposite is going to be darker. Leave your little gap there at the edge and curve these strokes around to match the shape. Colorless Blender over where that one ends. And again, if we want to add just a little bit more depth and show that this image is rounded, let's add a touch of color up that right hand side. Blend out again so it's really soft with your Colorless Blender. Shadow furthest from the light, let's start to do these strokes out. And soften that edge. Come in now from the top. Now the top one's a little bit different. So remember, we've got our light coming down here. Now remembering that this shape actually curves out, so it's not flat there, it's curving around. Our light would actually travel straight down this cone shape, and the front is actually going to be quite illuminated. Now we need to still show that this object is rounded. So to do this, we need to show a little bit of depth on the sides where the object would curve away from that light and wouldn't be hit by the ray from this perspective. So just using this darker color, I'm just adding a really small amount, following the shape around those edges. And you can come in and soften those edges again with your Colorless Blender. And then we just want a really small amount of shading underneath. So just like we explained before, when your light source comes from above, your shading's not very strong as a cast shadow, it's only a very small amount, but we still need to show something just to show a little bit of depth there and it's not sort of just floating in the air. So just adding that small amount around and softening out quite a bit with your Colorless Blender. Next shape is a cylinder. Same thing with the cylinder as the cone. We've actually got to remember that this isn't flat. It curves around on the side. So we need to show where the light's hitting on both sort of sides here so we get that curved nature showing. Light rays would come down from the top left, hitting both sides really a little bit there. I'm going to leave just a touch uncolored on the side. You can see I've left a little gap, and then let's curve these strokes around. So we're not doing straight, we're curving them to follow the shape. That also helps us to add more depth. As you get toward the middle, they can be a little bit softer. So use your Colorless Blender in there to soften. Now the top is going to be quite light because the sun is hitting all of this top section. So we'll leave that for now. You can pop in and do your cast shadow beneath. And that's going to be longer on the side that is further from the light, so on that right hand side. Soften that edge with your Colorless Blender beneath. Moving to the right here, same thing, light coming down. You don't need to draw in all of these light rays as well. I find it helps as a visual cue. If you're working on a tricky image, you can always draw these in with a lead pencil as well. And just erase them once you've done your colouring, and then you can see where the light's hitting all the different parts of the image first. Cast shadow underneath. Now from the middle here, I've got my light rays coming down, so we can see that it hits the top first. It's going to be quite light, but we know that this side, being further from the light, is going to be a lot darker. Now I just want the sides to actually pick up a little bit of that light. As you can see, our light rays are kind of coming down there. So I'm just going to pop in first, straight underneath this top section, adding some color, and I've left a really small amount of white on the two sides. Now you can layer this up a little bit, build up the depth. That's what you can do with alcohol markers, is continue layering to build it up. And I've extended the rest of the color that whole way down, showing that that side is a lot darker. Only a small cast shadow underneath, so just pop that in and around and soften with your Colorless Blender. You can see how different each of those look with the different light source as well there. Almost done. Now this bottom one is a different exercise. Now I'm not going to show you the shading of the spheres here, but if you're feeling a little bit more confident, by all means, please go ahead and add these in. But the purpose of these bottom shapes is I want you to focus on the cast shadows of two overlapping objects. So I've got here one object in front of the other. And as we explained before, the object that's in front or above is always going to be the one that casts a shadow on the object behind. I'm actually going to start on this one here, light source from the top right, because that's how my objects are orientated. This is the easiest one. Rays of light come down. So you can see that this object here is definitely in front. If I look at that, I can actually trace around the outline here, not putting any pen to paper, just following it along. And at this point here, I get an intersection. And that intersection shows me that this object comes around and it comes over this object here. You can see that line just runs through, cuts right through and above that line. So this object suddenly looks like it's sitting behind. So that's a little tip when you're coloring your objects. Look at that outline edge and see what's in front and what's behind. Now with that one behind, we know that object 1, so let's name this one 1 and 2. Object 1's in front, object 2's behind. What's in front always casts a shadow on what's behind. So what I do is literally just trace around the object in front. So I've followed the shape onto object 2. You can use your Colorless Blender just to soften that edge as well. But now we've got a nice step down and we can easily see now that shadow's in place that object 1 is in front. That's made it really prominent and obvious by those shadows being there. Popping over to this one on the left. Now, from our perspective here, our light's coming from this side. And see how it's now hitting these top edges. It's a little bit different. So we still know that object 1 is in front of object 2. That hasn't changed. But our shadow is not going to be as strong because the light is almost coming in and hitting underneath object 1 in a way. So what we're going to do here is just a very small cast shadow. And you can soften this as well if you want. It's still important to show that there's depth, and you can see there the difference between having nothing colored and having a little cast shadow shows that there's still a bit of three-dimensionality happening here. It's not as strong as what we did on the right hand side, but it's still showing that it's not flat. A lot of coloring doesn't have cast shadows. So I see a lot of people who are just starting out and they're wanting to learn more and they want to add that realism, but they lack these cast shadows. And you can see just from the comparison of these two different objects, even though the objects are still in front and behind here, this has no depth, it has no distance showing that in between. Whereas either one of these now shows that presence and it's showing that they're three-dimensional. So it's really, really important to add this in. Now don't worry if this is tricky at the start. It is, like I said right at the start of the video, it is one of the trickiest things to learn about coloring. It's not just kids coloring in. This is art theory. And that's one of those things, sometimes you see people say, you know, you don't need to do an art class, art is, you know, what you make of it. But these fundamentals are really important to understand, and any artist will tell you that. And these sort of things are what we teach in classes. We're teaching you art fundamentals for you to then go and make those stylistic choices to make art your own. It's not saying there's a right or wrong way to do things, but there are definitely theories that help you with creating more realistic artworks. Now in this bottom one here, we've got the light coming from above. It's still the same theory, 1 is above 2. Where the light hits, the shadow is only going to be quite small, like it was on the left. But as it gets quite further away from the light here, we can even increase that shadow down, showing that yes, in fact, that side is further from the light. And then you can use that Colorless Blender to soften. So you can see we've just gone through all of these different geometric shapes now, and they have so much more depth than they did before. We've really captured that they're not flat. So again, like we went through, it is quite tricky. Practice a few times, and when you go to color up your next image, ask yourself, where's my light coming from? So where's my highlight going to be? Where's that light hitting the object? The opposite of that is our shadow. So it's going to be our darkest. Where are our shadows occurring that I can add in my darker colors? And then you'll have that mid-tone between the highlight and shadow. And that's how we start to add more depth to our coloring. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've got any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask anytime. And to look at this in more in depth, you'll be going through this in all of our other classes as well, in a lot more detail and dedicated to the topics that you're learning. Thanks so much for watching, and I'm excited to see how you will go with this one.